Most security teams believe that if something is risky, they'll get an alert. If exposure appears, if something becomes reachable, if access opens up unexpectedly, they assume the tooling will catch it. See, most exposure doesn't trigger alerts at all. Think about how environments actually change. This is really important. A cloud service is exposed during a migration, a vendor integration expands permissions. You know how it goes. A firewall rule is loosened just for now. A certificate expires and gets reissued differently. None of that looks like an incident, right? Nothing crashes, nothing breaks, nothing fires an alert. Individually, every change looks harmless. Collectively, though, they quietly expand your external exposure. You see, this is where most security visibility is breaking down, because security tooling is very good at answering one question: what exists right now? But attackers don't operate in snapshot. You see, they operate in time. They don't need something to be vulnerable today if they know it was exposed last month and might come back again next month. This is why we keep seeing the same pattern in breaches. When incidents happen, the question isn't how did they exploit this, although I always like to know how it was exploited, but it's usually how long was this exposed before anyone noticed? That's the question. Weeks, months, sometimes longer. And the answer is rarely we missed a scan. It's usually we weren't measuring change. You see, most teams scan periodically. They scan weekly, monthly, quarterly. They fix what shows up, they close tickets, they move on. But between scans, environments keep changing. This is the key. Exposure doesn't stay fixed just because you looked at it once. Security teams are measuring state. They're not measuring behavior. Which exposures keep coming back, which fixes didn't stick, which assets reintroduced risk after remediation, or whether their overall exposure is trending up or down. Without that context, alerts are reactive by definition. They tell you something happened. They don't tell you something that's been quietly happening. This is what I call exposure drift. What is exposure drift? Exposure drift is what happens when risk accumulates between scans, outside alerts, and across normal operational changes. Nothing breaks, nothing triggers, but exposure grows anyway. And this leads to a second problem that doesn't get talked about enough. The most important risk isn't the vulnerability itself, it's the window of exposure. The time between when something becomes exposed and when someone notices. Attackers don't need 0 days. If exposure windows are long, they don't need to rush if no one is watching for drift. They wait. This is why point-in-time security keeps failing over and over. Not because teams aren't working hard, not because tooling is useless, but because measuring existence is not the same as measuring change. If you only ever ask, what does my environment look like today? And we've all been there, I have. You miss the story unfolding between today and the last time you looked. What actually matters is how fast exposure is growing, where it's growing, which assets keep reintroducing risk, and whether your fixes are actually durable. That's the difference between a visibility and understanding. This is what I mean by the exposure window. It's the gap between exposure appearing and exposure being understood. And that gap is where most real breaches live. Not in alerts, not in dashboards, but in the quiet time no one is measuring. If you want to reduce risk, you don't just need to find issues. You need to understand how exposure evolves. Because attackers don't need 0 days. They wait for drift.